And I see we're being recorded, so that's great.
Perfect.
Okay, I guess I'll just start with what is ontological commoning?
What is ontological commoning? Oh, thank you for that wonderfully precise question. Question, Jonah. Well, we start from two. Well, let's start from ontological and commoning, shall we? Commoning. Commoning is the commons have been talked about quite a lot, particularly since Elinor Ostrom in the physical commons, and knowledge commons has become a more and more common, a more and more frequent topic of conversation and writing over the recent years, with the idea not really to be confused with Creative Commons, because that's more of a licensing regime. But the idea of a knowledge commons is, if you go back to Ostrom and build that in, the idea of a knowledge commons is that a body of knowledge which is held in common by a group of people who are jointly, collectively maintaining and governing that knowledge. So that's the commons side. Ontological. Well, I think I approach the ontological side from a couple of different, from a number of different positions, from a number of different perspectives, and I think I'm going to explain what I mean by ontology as we go along here. I mean, ontology classically is to do with the study of what exists in the world. Otherwise sometimes known as metaphysics or branch of metaphysics. But ontology, so basically, if you're doing a knowledge commons, the question immediately arises, well, what is this knowledge about? What is this knowledge about? And if the danger, the challenge is that if people are incoherent, if the commoners, if you like, are incoherent about what this knowledge is about, you're not really going to have a coherent body of knowledge. So at the very least, there has to be some kind of basic understanding, and perhaps we'll come later to how extensive that basic understanding needs to be, between the knowledge commoners in order to even create and certainly to maintain a body of knowledge in common. So that's one aspect of commons. The other aspect of ontology is comes from the software and computer science world, and this has been around for at least 20 years, 25 years. For example, in the semantic web world, there's the OWL, the web ontology language, which has been around for a long time. Late 90s, I think people were already talking about ontology. I don't remember exactly when it was. And basically the ontology there is the recognition that my understanding of this, and I'm very happy to be corrected or improved on this, but my understanding of ontology in its information systems dimension is that when you write a computer program, you are actually dealing with representing certain things in the world. And there's a choice of what you're going to represent in your computer programs, your computer systems, your databases, or whatever it is. And so the ontology is what is represented in the software, if you like, the kind of, and by ontology, we don't just mean a taxonomy of things. Generally speaking, and particularly, for example, in OWL and other kind of information science treatments of ontology, we are talking about things and relationships. So we're not avoiding, we're not trying to sort of brush relationships aside. Relationships are just as important as entities in the whole kind of ontological world. That's certainly in my way. When I was studying systems analysis and design many years ago, one of the nice techniques is to do entity attribute relationship diagrams, and that's very much the kind of thing which gets you into the mindset of doing an ontology from a computer science point of view. Now, more recently, I've come back to the other side of my long-term interest. There's the computers and there's the humans, and that's very much the two sides, the information systems and the humans. But on the human side, what has become more and more clear to me is that the way people see the world is really quite individual, really quite depends on the individuals themselves. And typically, this might be affected by culture, by personal interest, and even by personal experience, trauma, etc. Because I think it's pretty well known that if you've suffered from traumatic experiences in your past, you'll be particularly acutely aware of those things which are related to your or impact on that or trigger your your memories or of your traumatic experience. So that will shift the way in which you see the world, and you will tend to see things as more significant and or less significant, depending on what is triggering you, depending on what is really important to you, or to put a less negative and more positive line, what really you value. So there we are in terms of so basically ontological commoning puts together these two things and is really saying that if we're going to help people to work together in any way, let's just leave it as working together, although I do include living together. If we're going to help people work together in any way, we have to, it's really going to need a basic understanding, a basic common understanding of what of the things that are held in common, the things we are talking about, the things that we relate to, the things which we commonly share, the world which we share. And when I look at contemporary politics, for example, I see people with very, very different worldviews. And if you look at the ontology there, it seems to me the ontology is quite different. What people mean by the terms, but also what is the significance of those terms is quite different. And to me, one of the really important things, because we cannot anymore rely on a kind of conventional, traditional set of assumptions on which our ontology is based anymore, because we've gone through the modernist and postmodernist era where we don't have that kind of stable ground anymore. Because we've gone through this really radically individualistic world where everybody sees things in their own different way, and they're all different. Everything is people's worldviews are very individual. In order to come together, and looking at the life itself agenda of conscious co-living, for example, in order to come together, for many, many reasons that we need to come together, we need to go through this process of ontological commoning to create a common basis of understanding. I think I better stop there and see if you've got any questions arising from that.
Great. Yeah, no, that's a great start, I think, in terms of like seeing it from a distance and getting an overview. So I guess what I heard there is that the main things I'm taking away is like there's a connection to the idea of a knowledge commons, and that you can see actually ontological commoning as a prerequisite for creating the kind of knowledge commons that we might want in many areas, but that it's also a prerequisite for these very sort of practical, personal, and political issues that arise out of disagreements, different worldviews clashing with each other, and that this can therefore be not just something to address this sort of IT type project of creating a knowledge commons, but actually a way to address some really serious global and national political issues. So that's I think a really interesting context there. I guess what I want to maybe direct us to next is like you're talking about it as a process.
Mhm. Yeah.
What in practice does that process look like? Let's say, I guess, maybe there are different versions of it depending on whether you're talking about between two individuals, or maybe there are other contexts, I don't know, other different versions of the process, and
Mhm.
maybe we can focus on one to see, precisely what in practice it looks like.
Okay, let me step back a little bit and say this is a methodology in creation. It's not something which I see it as an invitation, really. The phrase ontological commoning, I only even started using it just a couple of years ago. And so when I talk about ontological commoning, um, I'm really intending it as an invitation for people to explore this ground. I think I'm sort of setting out the need for it, and I'll just say a little bit more about the scope because I think there's one important thing which I haven't mentioned yet about the scope. And this is very important if you want to distinguish between a kind of collectives in the Keegan third order sense and the sort of metamodern collectives in the fifth order sense. Very, very important. When I'm talking about ontological commoning, I'm not saying that everybody has got to agree on a completely the same worldview. I think that's totally unrealistic these days anyway. And it would squash this variety. And in some ways, that's what one of the problems with modernism is that we've had these competing universalizing worldviews like this is the way you should see things. No, that is the way you should see things. But each of those has the inherent problem of being a kind of totalizing kind of like, this is the complete setup. And what I see as needing is not that. What I do see us needing is the common ground of communication. And a little metaphor which I sometimes use, perhaps a little bit more than a metaphor, is the metaphor of the mycelium in the soil. We have these different trees of knowledge, if you like. And I'm not saying that we all have to, I think it would be very reductionist and very imperialist even, or even, choose your other nastyism, to insist that we all have there is one big tree of knowledge and we're all attached to the same tree. But if you think about it in mycelial terms, there is this underground linkage which affords communication and exchange of nutrients and various other exciting things underneath the ground, which has only just recently been discovered properly, and creates the soil in which different trees can grow and flourish. And indeed, new seeds can grow and flourish. So when I'm talking about ontological commoning, it's really important to be clear that I'm not talking about creating a single worldview. I am talking about creating sufficient interconnections, sufficient groundwork, so that the different worldviews which we have can see each other, can communicate with each other, can understand each other in their own terms. I can understand you in my terms, you can understand me in your terms. And it's that layer of the communication commons, if you like, which I think is absolutely vital to what I'm talking about. So I've set this out in my recent wiki post about how I see it happening, and how I see it happening is basically that this is still really theoretical because I haven't really followed this through in practice, and I would love to. But how I see it happening is people starting with stories that make sense to them. What is this? What is your story? And that there's a certain amount of work to be done in actually finding a question which can prompt relevant connected stories between two different people. I mean, perhaps you can supply some, perhaps our other people here can supply some, but what do we need to do? I mean, what's the story of the Second Renaissance would be a good one in this context. What do we need to do in order to address the meta crisis? What is the story of how did we get into the meta crisis in the first place, and how do we get out of it? Those are all good stories, and I call them stories. I've mentioned the phrase. I've also mentioned the phrase, which is more used in business. What am I trying to say? The way in which not the narrative, but the chip in if you've got an answer for me. But it's not really. I'm calling them stories because theory of change. That's what I'm trying to get at. So people in business talk a lot about theory of change, but actually, when you see a theory of change, are you really talking about a theory, or are you actually just talking about a narrative? My sense is that people are just effectively spinning a story. This is how it might look. There's very little. I haven't seen any theory of change with any theoretical basis to it, although that's maybe my lack. So I call them stories, including theory of change. But and underneath every story, one can perceive a belief system. But when you talk about stories, I mean, like you can apply this anywhere. Like you can apply this to, I mean, you can apply this to Cold War, communism, capitalism. You can apply this these days to American politics, Republican versus Democrat. They have very, very different stories about what's going on. And underneath those stories is a belief system. Underneath each story is a belief system. But if you try and actually put stories head to head, you're not actually going to get any exciting results, because people are just going to say, my story is right. No, my story is right. And you're not really getting any communication there. If you put belief systems head to head, I don't think you're going to get very much joy, because you're going to get saying, well, I believe this, well, I believe that. So what I'm suggesting about the process of ontological commoning is that we get underneath the belief system, and we look at the terms of the ontology. We get down to that. And at that point, we compare the terms that we've got in the different people, the different groups, or the different parties, or whatever they are, and say, well, let's look, how do we actually cross map these things? Are there some equivalent terms? Do terms map to each other? In what kind of way? And that, to me, seems the most promising way that I can think of actually doing ontological commoning and creating this sort of communication commons. And maybe we can actually, from the people that are here, maybe we can come up with potential ideas as to, what could be a good test case for this.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's really useful. I guess I'm wondering if I'm thinking there might be certain existing approaches to, let's say, conflict resolution that have sort of quite specific practices where they recommend, particular phrases or questions being asked. And I wonder if you see it sort of wanting to develop uh, this process in that direction of actually having quite specific questions that you suggest people ask, even down to particular wording of questions. Is that sort of direction you'd want to develop this, assuming you haven't already?
Mhm.
Or would you want to sort of keep it quite flexible in a way in terms of then really just focus on, what's the concept here?
What's the concept and what the implications of the concept?
Yeah, sort of thinking about it as a practice, that could be like maybe taught in a
Well,
course or
I, I, th- I
something
think
like that.
I think
Mm.
what I'd like to do is I'd like to learn from and include the insights from a number of different dialogue practices that we know about. Um, I mean, a really good start is NVC, nonviolent communication, um, because in NVC, um, that's kind of like to me the sort of one of a really helpful first step because people are encouraged to own their own feelings. I feel this, I believe this, or whatever it is, and not project it onto other people. That's a really good start. Um, and then also, it's not just a personal practice, it's also a practice where you are trying to see what the motives are in the other person or the other people. So I do think it's a good start doing that kind of thing. So I would be wanting to look at practices like NVC, and there are many others. I mean, like if you talk about conflict resolution, then actually restorative circles is based around NVC, so you can take some of that as well. And um, but I'm very open to other ways, other kind of good practices which appear to relate to conflict resolution, for example. I think it'd be really nice to look at those and see how do those actually key in to this sort of framework and what insights can we learn from all of those and put them together into. But I think fundamentally, I mean, each one of those is also a story. So sometimes we've got to actually jump up a whole level and say, okay, there's the NVC story, and there's maybe there's the internal family system story, and how do they relate, and what are we? And ultimately, we're not trying to do this for everybody at all times. I want to I want to encourage people to see it as um, a pragmatic methodology for helping people live or work together. So it's not, I don't want to sort of like, oh, we're going to solve the whole, we're going to solve conflict in the world. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Dream on. But I do think that if we get into real dialogue, we have a chance of um, of making progress and helping people actually come to terms with each other.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, and I especially think it makes sense to, yeah, you'll need to reuse or bring in elements of existing practices because they just sort of apply quite generally, and things like, I don't know, hedging statements with this is what I am feeling right now, or I think right now. It just seems to be the kind of thing you'd want to bring in. I guess I'm thinking that what's unique about this approach is probably going to boil down to like a few very specific questions that sort of become core to the practice in a way. So some questions to do with, um, I guess, belief systems and, well, yeah, trying to get to the underlying ontology. Like there might be a question like, okay, what's the belief being assumed underneath that story you've just told?
Yes, yes,
And then there
absolutely.
might be a question like, okay, what and this is what I'm sort of interested in, like how do you actually phrase that question about ontology? Is it like what do you believe exists? Is that the question you end up asking, or
Actually, well, the way I've drafted, in my writing so far about this, the way I've imagined it, um, is almost technical. I mean, if you actually have helped somebody to lay out their belief system,
Mhm.
um, that belief system will be expressed in certain terms. Like uh, 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 the most obvious thing is like, really the most obvious example to use, and perhaps non-controversial, is belief systems which involve God. Okay, God in some belief systems is an entity. Okay, and God does certain things. Okay, so beliefs about God is benevolent, God is does this, God control, God is omni, all that sort of thing. That's the content of the belief system, but the ontology is, well, God, and in fact, the Trinity is an ontology actually as well. And so you can, irrespective of how you see the actual, um, irrespective of your beliefs around that ontology. So I'm saying, so the question would be something like, okay, I see you have a belief about, I see this is this is a belief of yours. Okay, so this is something which you think is real. This is something you think is real. This is a real relationship which you understand as a relationship. Um, yeah, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. That sounds right. It does seem like
Mhm.
this idea of reality is closely
Yeah,
connected to this idea of ontology. It's not,
absolutely.
in a way,
Yeah.
we're not interested in, like, if I tell a story that involves Father Christmas, say, and that's important to me, but I don't actually believe that Father Christmas is real, then that seems less important somehow to resolving. Yeah, like what I guess what we end up disagreeing on is the things that we both think are real, and that ends up with some kind of, yeah, we're just in cases where one person thinks something is real and another person thinks something is not real, I suppose. So maybe the Father Christmas case is relevant because, like, maybe there
Mm,
is someone who,
mm, mm.
I mean, in this hypothetical example, thinks Father Christmas is real, and then that becomes important. Um, yeah.
I'm hesitating a bit by saying, because something is real is actually a belief.
Hmm.
So I'm trying to sort of struggle here and say, well, what's the question? Which I think I misspoke that. It's not, the question isn't this is real. The question is this is a term which I'm actually in which I'm expressing my belief system. And that's why I think, in a way, maybe it is less of something which you can do in dialogue and more something which you can do more technically. Actually, okay, like see the written words, pick out the terms,
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
and
Okay.
then the question then comes in. The interesting question comes in at the commoning level. When I say God and you say Allah, do we mean the same thing?
Mhm.
Or whatever it is. I mean, that's perhaps not a very good example, but you
Mhm.
get the idea.
Yeah, that seems like a good example. And then the question for me is how would you then go about following that question up? And it seems like one thing, it sort of reminds me of what you said about attributes and
Mhm.
relations, that actually,
Mhm.
if you just focus on the objects, then but they seem like two names for two different things. But what you want to look at is what attributes you think these objects have and what relations they have to other things.
Totally.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
then by looking at
Yeah.
those, you can work out if they are actually the same things. They have the same attributes and same relations. Um,
Yeah. Then they are
like
equivalent.
actually,
Yeah, basically.
the names are not relevant. Uh,
My expectation is that you may not get many exact matches like that, but what you
mm,
will see is you'll see a sort of a web of partial connection. You'll see a web of connections, and maybe then you can go down. And I haven't really explored this very much, but maybe you can actually go down in your ontology. Well, if there are if there are certain things which correspond and certain things which don't correspond, can you actually separate out those different aspects of whatever it is you're talking about and get down to an even lower level of ontology where you can agree on the basic fundamentals?
Hmm. Okay, I mean, I think we've
Yeah,
had like half an hour.
let's open it up. Let's open
Yeah,
it up.
exactly.
Yeah,
I'm thinking we could just make this a
perfect.
open dialogue at this point. So if either of the others want to come in with a question.
Great to see that Robert is going to. I haven't studied what Cynefin say
Mm.
about this, and it would be nice to see that. So hopefully Robert is going to help us with that. And hey, what if I'm reinventing something which Cynefin has done? Great, fantastic. Let's compare them compare them and see what there is.
Yeah, and if no one else has any thoughts just at this minute, I guess what I'm thinking now is, okay, how does this compare to, let's say, um, and it's interesting you mentioned like you might want to see it written down. Um, uh, how does this compare with just the kind of like written debates you might have in published writing, for example, in academia or even outside academia, where you have people sort of presenting views and then responding to those views, criticizing views,
Hmm.
and often there, I guess, people do sometimes try and like clarify what this term means and make sure they're targeting the right thing. And let's say, so you'd spell out in a way your opponent's ontology, or what in practice what that means then is what they mean by
Hmm.
a particular term, to ensure you're not criticizing a straw man. You want to capture uh, the
Hmm.
thing that person is really talking about. Um,
Well,
but equally, I can see a lot of times that doesn't
mhm.
happen, and then the critic gets accused of arguing
Yeah,
it's a straw man.
yeah.
And that is a very
There's
common thing
assumptions.
that happens.
I I would agree with that completely and say
Mm,
basically in my experience there is not enough of that done and much more
mm,
assumptions are being made. Oh,
mm,
you said this and therefore you must mean that. Well, actually no, but no, you said that and this means this and
mm,
this
mm,
is what and you get that kind of sort of energy which is not really very helpful. And and I think particularly when you start telling people what they believe,
mm,
ouch, oof, you must believe that. If you say that, then obviously you believe the other. Well, ask them, do you believe? Don't say that you believe something. Actually, ask people. But I think basically the bulk, the real thrust of what I'm saying is that the attempts to communicate often don't get down deep enough into the ontology.
mm,
Naima.
So basically, I've been noticing, I don't know if like I've missed it or not because I was commuting, but there is a missing
Mhm.
component in like conflict resolution or in like starting this kind of communication. Like if somebody is in an emotional space, you cannot come and reason with somebody in an emotional space. So most of the time, it's about bypassing the emotional state and then going into the headspace. So if somebody is like speaking their truth, their belief as if it's truth, you cannot just come and tell them no, but the reason doesn't say this, and like my point of view is that because you're coming from a different space. So
Yeah.
part of part of it, I think, should be centered about like reassurance, validation, until like the nervous system has been calmed down, and then like, and not in the same day, not in the same hour, not in the same blog post. Like it's a much slower pace sort of thing to to move
Yeah.
a person from an emotional state to their headspace, to where they can communicate and like see your point of view. As a certain type of trust, no matter how superficial it is, should be established to enable this kind of commons. I don't know if I'm making sense, but yeah.
Totally. Absolutely right. Absolutely right. I think everything you say there is, to me, spot on. And I think, to me, the theoretical framework which I've come across recently to take this forward is IFS, internal family systems. So in other words, if somebody is being reactive, if somebody is being, some people say triggered, which is a word which sometimes works, then you can imagine them as responding from a particular part personality.
Yeah.
And the part personality
With the
probably,
differentiation between triggered and reactive, right? Like there's a big difference.
that's well, let's do some ontological commenting on that later, because because that's an interesting point. I don't know, but let's just say I just want to illustrate this from the parts for the moment, that a protector part in IFS probably has a very, very limited and clear ontology. There is an enemy. You are the enemy. There is a threat. That is the threat. And all those sort of very, very basic things. I have a particular identity. My identity is being, or whatever it is, and what I'm hearing from you, Naima, is a really important thing, that if somebody's in that emotional space, they need validation. In other words, and I think this is the fundamental message of IFS, which comes across to me: respect the protector parts, don't dismiss them. And so, in other words, yes, okay, just maybe feedback. You see this as the enemy, you see this as the danger, you see that as the whatever it is. And
But I
yeah,
insist there is one step before it, which is like differentiating between reactive and triggering, because sometimes it's a
go
combination
ahead.
of both. Sometimes it comes from, so if you're talking about internal family systems, sometimes it comes from a past wound, from a trauma that the person is being triggered and like doing protection on the other. But sometimes the other person unknowingly have said something or approached a certain subject in a way that would have created a reaction. So it has nothing to do with basically your traumas in a sense, but they've said it in a way also based in their traumas, but also based on their past experiences that like promoted this emotional reaction. And this is not like, like you're being triggered because of past traumas. It's because actually the other person have stepped a boundary of somehow, and you're still not very well versed in like having emotional control in very short time, or like or you're like embodying an online ego in a way that you're anonymous and you can write whatever you want, or like there's no confrontation. So yeah, so there is a difference. For example, if you're triggering, like if you came from your own embodiment of past traumas and you initiated a reaction in the other person, you cannot play the role of like validation, and there's steps to it. Like I cannot come to Lauren and tell her something like that she finds like not because it's based on something that is inside her, like her parts, but like somehow I offended her and then she reacted. I cannot come and like try to connect with her directly emotionally, like on the emotional level, like wait, like I have to step back, I have to take accountability, and then maybe if she allows it, then I can approach her again, like and like give her validation. So there is this complexity in interrelation. It depends. So this is why I was telling you there is a difference between triggers and sometimes they overlap. Sometimes it's different. It's also two people. It's a group. It's a country.
Absolutely. I mean, yes. Point one of agreement is yes, it's complex. I completely agree. I think the way I would put it is that so I think because there is a tendency, that there's a tendency in emotionality generally to want to find a cause for it, and and I think it's you made me angry, or or oh, it was my, I was just being triggered by my past by past trauma or whatever it is. Like both of those are looking for a cause, and actually, this word actually is such a real bind. I want to exclude it from I want to wash my mouth out with soap now. Do not say the word actually. um, um, the way I see it, not actually, is that there are maybe always these different contributory factors in a particular yeah, well, yes, okay, thanks for the Kanavin. There are these different contributory factors in which contribute to anybody's emotional state or emotional reaction. And I think that's really lovely, actually, because it's always a mixture, and in varying proportions. It's not 50-50. It may be, more of one and more of the other. And in extreme cases is what you said. In extreme cases, you could say, well, it's just triggering. In extreme cases, it's just, you're being a, you're being a bastard or whatever it is, and but largely speaking, the makeup is somewhere, is a combination, and that means that everybody can do something. And it's, and it's not to assign responsibility and blame to people, but it's just saying, it's just like everybody in a complex, in a complex system of conflict, and conflicts usually are complex, everybody has the power to do something about it, even if that something isn't effective. That would be my belief. Does that make sense, Naima? I mean, is that kind of consistent roughly with what you're saying, or is it different?
And it's very consistent, but still it has like multiple layers to it. It does not, it's not, I don't know. Like maybe because I deal with like generational traumas based in conflict zones. It's far more complicated than actually like just handling an online disagreement maybe. But yeah, I'm also trying to make sense of it. It's not a straight line. It spirals. It goes in different directions. It sometimes there is good times. Then there is lots of factors that goes into it, and yeah. So making sense of it is
yeah, and thanks for bringing it.
Like if there is like a sort of like an outline or like a like set of rules that you can follow, and it assures you a definitive outcome, then okay. But what I've learned is that you should not hang on to definitive outcomes, and it differs from one person to another. So
yeah.
So
thanks for bringing in the intergenerational side, because I think that's really an important thing to recognize that. Yeah, absolutely. That it's not just you or the other person. It may just be, patterns which have come down to you. I would guess, and correct me if your experience is different from this, but my guess is that a lot of these, a lot of intergenerational trauma is expressed as stories sometimes, and expressed as stories or myths which are passed down. And that would be, to me, bring it back to ontological commoning. That would be where I would start. I would start to say, okay, I would listen to the story. I wouldn't, you know, the last thing I would do would be to try and negate or challenge the story. But I would ask, okay, there's the story. Do you agree that's the story? Okay, let's look at that story and tease out the belief system underneath that story. And then go ahead and tease out the ontology underneath that belief system. And then, whoa, yes. And, you know, the Middle East, which is obviously heavily in your experience, I can just imagine the Middle East is somewhere where it would be absolutely wonderful to actually do some of that work. How you do it, goodness me. I mean, it's big, big, big work.
It's the same shit everywhere, so.
It's just clearer in some parts of the world than others, and the Middle East is one place
There's
where it's
something
bloody
in Turkish. There's this proverb. They say it's
Yeah.
it's the same shit, different shade. So
Oh, okay.
yeah, but also there is something that I need to point out. Sometimes what's happening in the psyche, like even being fully aware of what's happening in your generational trauma and in your parts and your internal family system, and
Yeah.
still we did once a workshop with Palestinian kids, and it was about therapy through art, and they would do these small animation movies about their dreams. And then they every video, like every small animation that came out with clay stuff, it was like dreams about returning to Palestine. Then all of the videos turned out this way, like dreams of Palestine. And then after the workshop, there was interviews with them. And one question was asked, like, if you were to return now to Palestine, what would you do? And most of them imagined not returning because they don't have friends, they don't have anyone over there, they don't know how it looks like. So
Wow.
there is also this dissociation between the myth and what has been passed down to you and the actual reality of your cognitive conscience.
That's really fascinating. Yes.
So,
fascinating. Yeah.
And okay, now you say Middle East, it's complicated, but trust me, throughout my work, like it's the same, I don't know how to put it, but it's the same methodology that it moves in other
and
people.
the same sort of, yeah.
Yeah, it's the same pattern for
same big patterns. Yeah.
Yeah, the same pattern. Like it doesn't matter if it's a first world problem or a third world problem. It's the same impact depending on how flexible, how stretchy your like psychological component and your exposure is. So
that's really nice. Yeah. That's really interesting. And I'd be very and just taking on something that I hear in the back as an implication is that it's a good idea not to say, oh, they're the problem over there and we're okay, because that's just simply not true. Yeah.
Like I can get into you. It's the same kind of emotions and processing that a Palestinian kids in a constrained camp and I don't know, in the Middle East, it would be the same guy who is like extremely reacting to you on an intellectual forum. It's the same embodiment of anger and fear and just different name.
Great. I'm aware we're coming up on the hour, but that's been a really great discussion. Thanks, everyone.
So I'm interested in one more thing, like how this ontological commoning can be applicable. Like how can it be? Like how do you see its implication would be?
What in a conflict resolution terms, or in what terms were you thinking? Can you give me a particular scenario?
In the abstract term of the way you presented it, like what kind of applications do you see this possible, and what is the actual timeline? Like what's the time frame?
Yeah, I think here we're venturing into areas which I simply don't know the answer to, and I would love to explore. I really don't have a clear answer to that. But I think, yeah, I mean, let me put it in a different context. I mean, what I've just been trying to write just recently is about how this fits into a big intergenerational, like multiple generational kind of pattern of which I see as my story about this is the story of political and economic separation and breaking of connections and breaking of bonds and individualization. So I see this as a small contribution to the methodology of regenerating relationship. So, and if you see it in that if you see it in that big view, then the question to me is, any regeneration of genuine relationship is, yeah, well, let's do that. So I would sort of turn that round and say, what are the contexts in which you see relationship has been lost and could be regenerated? And if there's any situation where relationship has been lost and should be regenerated, whether it's between people, groups of people, people and nature, like countries, people, and people in the natural world, people in the globe, how can we use this approach? Well, I don't want to be kind of I don't want to be sort of like overclaiming about this. It's just an approach. Could we use this approach to helping to regenerate relationship? And I do think that that's actually a key part of the second Renaissance. That's how I see it fitting in here to life itself and so forth.